Thanks to everyone for joining us today for our discussion on tech companies' responsibility in restoring elections integrity, disinformation, deepfakes, and distrust. We're hoping to get through that and also look at some of the positive developments, of course, with the use of AI or technology as we move through this discussion. Because we have a lot to get through, I'm going to start off as people are trickling into the room. So again, hello to everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Anita Dorette, and I'm the director of the Investor Alliance for Human Rights. The Investor Alliance is a human rights advocacy organization that serves to provide a collective and collaborative action platform for responsible investment that is grounded in respect for people's fundamental rights. We are organized as a coalition of global institutional investors, and with over 240 global institutional investors managing over 14 trillion in assets, we strive to drive and equip investors' engagement on human rights risks in their investments. Through our collaboration with human rights experts, civil societies, and communities who are adversely impacted by business activities, we try to bring this discussion to investors to inform their decision and actions throughout their investment cycle to ensure that they respect human rights in their activities. Our webinar today is being recorded. The recording of the webinar and slides will be made available to all registrants shortly after the webinar. While all attendees are muted, you will have an opportunity to ask questions at the end. And we'll leave ample time for that. So please put your questions as the webinar goes on into the Q&A box. So let me start off with a brief introduction before we kick off. And of course, you see on this sharing screen with me today 4 wonderful panelists. But today we will be discussing the impact of technology on democracy, how technology has changed elections around the world. The 2016 US election served as a wake-up call that technology can cause widespread data manipulation and disinformation. Fast forward to 2024, we have elections taking place in over 64 countries this year. This includes the world's biggest democracies, the United States, India, South Africa, and Mexico, countries that are in active conflict like Ethiopia, and companies where democracies are fragile and heightened risks of deterioration of human rights are abound. The role of tech giants, threats of deepfake, foreign influence demands all require our urgent attention. Our discussion today aims to spotlight these issues and better understand how tech companies must champion transparency and integrity, ensuring that democratic processes remain robust and trusted. Investors recognize tech's impact on human rights of users and society in general, and have been engaging with technology companies on a range of digital rights risks for a number of years, including since 2021 as part of a collective engagement initiative that we lead, the Investor Alliance leads. This year, investors have also engaged on risk to election integrity and have filed proposals with big tech companies that is intended to go to vote at the company's annual general meeting this spring and summer. Proposals touch on salient risks that arise from lack of robust content management of misinformation in the global majority, how risks are exacerbated by generative AI. But let's go to the panelists who will talk about this today. So as I said, we have 4 amazing expert speakers who are sharing the Zoom screen with me, and half of our panelists used to work with big tech companies working on electoral, political, and social advertising policies and on tackling systemic issues in public content ecosystems. So I will introduce our panelists just before we speak. And so to kick us off, we have Alexandra Pardell, Interim Co-Executive Director of Digital Action. And she'll help set the scene, providing a global overview of the risk to election integrity and honing in on the inequity that exists between regions, the global north and the global majority, when it comes to protection of from harms by tech platforms, from disinformation, hate speech. Digital Action has been running a campaign, the Year of Democracy 2024, focusing on this issue. But let me hand off to Alexandra to tell us more. Thank you, Alexandra.
Thank you. So as Anita has said, we have launched last year alongside over 200 member organizations and experts in a coalition we've convened and brought together called the Global Coalition for Tech Justice to focus on this mega cycle of elections this year. So our initiative is called Protect People and Elections, Not Big Tech. And we're catalyzing a global movement to leverage the respective power, influence, and voice within the coalition and within stakeholders, both in this room and externally, in favor of equitable and effective platform safeguards to protect democratic and human rights this year. Next slide. So as we have heard, over 2 billion people are expected to vote in over 64 elections across the world, maybe even more. You know, elections are being announced every week across the world. And yet we're also faced with the reality that most online platforms and messaging services are basically taking a largely business as usual approach to this year, but with much, much lower numbers of trust and safety professionals due to tech layoffs in the past 18 months. And that's in a context of more intense and serious threats to election integrity and human rights, including, for example, the more prolific and deceptive disinformation campaigns waged with AI content. So aside from Meta, which made a single reference to one new global election policy, Google, YouTube, and TikTok, in blog posts they published in advance of this year, solely talked about the US presidential elections, right? While X has not communicated basically at all about its plans for securing this year's election megacycle. So we are faced with a situation in which we know very, very little to nothing of what the platforms have prepared to protect elections, as Anita has said, in some of the most fragile, unstable contexts, in situations where we know there are very, very high risks, in elections which are always flashpoints for online harms and their offline consequences. Next slide, please. So there is a global equity crisis at the center of tech accountability, with platforms focused mainly on the US elections, resourcing US elections efforts, while the majority of their users are actually found elsewhere in the world. Companies are barely investing in harm assessment and mitigation outside the US and English language content. That has been the case for years and years, but this year in particular, this poses particularly serious risks. And impacts are becoming more serious, more extensive, and more frequent. So what I'm going to do is take you on a bit of a whistle-stop tour across some of the regions with risks that already have materialized in past elections and in previous years, and then looking ahead at some of the elections that are going to be taking place. Next slide, please. So if we take Latin America, well, we already know we have, you know, from last year, a repeat of the US Capitol attacks in Brazil, with supporters of Jair Bolsonaro storming government buildings at the beginning of last year, in repeat scenes that we have seen in the US. So the platforms had been warned in advance. They knew that fake election fraud claims had been circulating. It was clear that supporters of Jair Bolsonaro were mobilizing using WhatsApp, using Telegram, disinformation, you know, and misinformation proliferating on the platforms. And we saw the results. Safeguards weren't in place. You know, there wasn't sufficient moderation taking place on the platforms. Elsewhere in, you know, since then in the Argentinian elections, we've seen intense use of AI-generated content by the main candidates to discredit their opponents. And I mean, for example, we have Javier Milei, who won the elections using fabricated images of his rival, Sergio Massa, for example, depicting him as an old-fashioned communist in military garb with his hand raised aloft in salute. That image drew kind of 3 million views. You had also deep fakes of Sergio Massa circulating on social media. Also in Chile, a vote in the previous year for a referendum on a new constitution, which would have replaced the constitution imposed during the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet. That proposed constitution, a progressive one, was rejected by voters following a flood of misinformation on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, and WhatsApp. And a survey post-ballot found that a majority of people had been swayed by those fake news stories. For example, the proposed constitution would allow abortion up to 9 months of gestation. So in Latin America, we're seeing, real impacts from social media. And this October, we have municipal elections in Brazil, with many experts saying that could be a rallying point for the far right and for Bolsonaro supporters again to rally and to polarize the political debate and spread misinformation. So just moving on to the next slide and the Middle East. The Middle East and North Africa, many very difficult contexts in terms of, authoritarian regimes, or, for example, Tunisia. Here on the slide, we have in Tunisia a President Kais Saied, who has, over the past few years, been taking the country into dictatorship and using, with his supporters, platforms, principally Facebook, it's his communication platform of choice, to target and dox his opponents. So we have here on the slide human rights defender Rania Amdouni, who's exiled now. She's had to flee the country because she was involved in anti-government protests against Said's oppressive measures, and as a result, she was targeted on social media. Her doxed, her address and cell number circulated online, obviously against platform policies, and she's suffered death threats as a result. And this is something that it's not an isolated case. Judges as well within the country have suffered the same sort of online orchestrated social media campaigns against them. And that's all part of this descent into dictatorship in the country, with this year's election being a key context which could see the end of democracy in that country. Next slide. We go to Africa. Unmoderated hate speech is clearly leading to real-world violence, in many African countries. We have here on the slide, 3 investigations. In Ethiopia, Amnesty International has done extensive investigations on the role of Facebook in fanning ethnic violence and facilitating the proliferation of content that incites serious human rights abuses against the Tigrayan community there. There's a terrible case described in that report of the kind of hate speech and doxing of a Professor Mereg Amare in Facebook posts, which they wouldn't take down. It was reported, they didn't take those posts down, and he was killed outside his home shortly afterwards. In Kenya, in the elections there, same story: hate speech, disinformation, flooding platforms. Facebook in the Global Witness investigation, in fact, approving ads, calling for killings.
Alex, we've got about, I wonder if you could wrap up in about a minute.
Yes, yes. So if we can go to the next slide. So again, the same story in Asia, across these regions, we have systemic platform failures due to inadequate investments in trust and safety and localized policies, content moderation, and enforcement, a lack of enforcement of policy violations, lack of human rights assessments and mitigations. If we go to the next slide. So what investors can do is really to request full disclosure of risk assessment and mitigation relating to 2024 elections, share their plans, share the safeguards that are being put in place, and make disclosures of what their trust and safety spending is, so we can see the full extent, and if there are the disparities that are in place that need to be addressed, so that we can actually start having an honest conversation about why platforms are failing to safeguard people in elections and what we can do this year to make a difference. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alexandra. Really interesting for you to call out the examples in different parts of the world. Sorry we didn't manage to get through Asia, but maybe we can pick some of that up during question and answers. But, really resonating the fact that in the global majority, social platform companies, in particular Facebook, is their town hall. And hence the responsibilities there. And so we have now Tim Harper, Senior Policy Analyst at Center for Democracy and Technology, who will talk about AI's impact on the 2024 elections and how investors can highlight different risk angles from also different stakeholders' perspective while engaging with tech companies. Tim, I believe, will also touch on the perspective from the upcoming US elections, drawing from a report that was published by CDT last year on how economic, technological, and political trends are challenging independent counter-election disinformation incentives in the United States. We'll provide links to that within the deck. But with that, to hand off to Tim, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Anita and Alexandra. Always difficult to follow such great panelists on these sorts of events. Thank you, everyone. I think this is a really important topic. I think we can go to the first slide here just to kind of set the scene. And I think Alexandra did a really great job of this at the top of this webinar. The way in which AI will impact 2024 elections around the world and in the United States is still largely to be determined. We know that there are significant risks here, and we know that these things are already starting to happen. As you can see here, there have been high-profile instances of generative AI being used and misused in ways that cause concern. They also cause significant media attention and interest from the general public who are intrigued about this issue that they're learning about, for large part, for the first time. The DeSantis campaign created fake images of Trump hugging Dr. Fauci. There more recently was an instance of a fake robocall, an AI-generated robocall being used to discourage Democrats from voting in the New Hampshire primary. And so we are seeing these things along a very diverse set of surfaces, right? So to set the scene, as I think that we've kind of done so far, 2024 represents the largest election cycle we've seen since the advent of the internet. Almost half the global population will be in countries that will have elections this year. And generative AI has now become a significant issue in that. Next slide, please. Just a quick taxonomy of generative AI and its risks to elections. Just to kind of lay the groundwork here, generative AI is a type of software. It uses statistical models that generalize patterns and structures of existing data to recognize and create new patterns that can then produce text, video, images, and audio files. And so we're seeing these techniques used for a variety of ways in which there are significant risks. So I'll kind of walk through some of the biggest risks that we see to elections this year, and then get into some of the solutions. The first one that I think gets a lot of the kind of lion's share of attention are deepfakes. So what is a deepfake? It is a image or video or audio recording that convincingly alters and manipulates or misrepresents someone as doing or saying something that was not actually done or said. There are a couple examples here. On the bottom, you can see an example of a fake video of President Zelensky, which encouraged Ukrainian troops to lay down their arms. On the top, these are examples of avatars that are completely artificial people. They're not deep faking any individual, but are instead a realistic depiction of a completely non-real person. These were avatars created by the Chinese government to propagate a coordinated and authentic behavior campaign across YouTube that achieved something like over 700,000 subscribers and hundreds of millions of views, in which the Chinese government laundered propaganda that was anti-American and anti-democratic. We expect to see things like these examples utilized in upcoming elections in 2024. Next slide. In addition to deepfakes, there are a number of risks that I want to kind of highlight as major things that we're looking at this year. The first being hyper-local misinformation and personalized messaging. Generative AI has the ability to facilitate generating the spread of hyper-local messaging at scale. So take the example of polling conditions at individual precincts on election day. Bad actors could use publicly available precinct location data combined with phone numbers that are publicly available to distribute AI-generated content with highly specific claims about named polling places. So the example I've included here says, hey, voting at Peace Auditorium is paused because of fire sprinklers. Like that sort of example is something that is deeply concerning, because a voter could see this and say, hey, I know that that is my polling precinct, that I recognize that as an actual fact about something impacting me, and they may be more vulnerable to this because this information could be spread on surfaces that they're not used to seeing misinformation. We know that voters have become increasingly aware that social media is a surface in which they should fact check their information and be suspicious that the information they're seeing could be biased. But text messages and WhatsApp and things like that that are more private messaging oriented are not typically a place voters are very familiar with getting misinformation, especially if it's hyper locally targeted. Next slide. Another area of significant risk is the way in which generative AI creates opportunities to influence specific language minority communities that otherwise had been not where in previous years, foreign governments and coordinated inauthentic behavior campaigns thought that these sorts of activities weren't worth the squeeze. A traditional influence operation has typically been struggled to engage in language expertise. Translating misinfo into other languages was expensive and labor intensive and difficult without having people that are familiar with a community. But Gen AI can target language communities with bespoke persuasion and misinformation content to discourage direct voting. So an example here is translating content that says something like, there is a lot of crime. They say vote Y into Filipino from English to access Filipino communities in the United States. Now, this could have a big influence in, for instance, swing states where language minorities can have a significant influence in an important election. Next slide, please. There are also a number of ways in which generative AI can have impacts for cybersecurity, for election officials, for election processes. One way for election processes is that AI can be used to generate convincing election records, to duplicate potentially fake ballots or votes to change ballot totals and things like that. For election offices, Gen AI can be used to spoof websites, to create false records of election night returns. It can be used to create scripts and voice cloning, to create fake voter calls to overwhelm election call centers, produce FOIA requests that can overwhelm an office with paperwork, or create extremely convincing phishing campaigns that can be personalized and persuasive to gain access to the backside of election systems to create chaos for an election office. For election officials, there can be deepfakes of the election officials themselves or can be used to harass and impersonate election officials. So there's a number of vulnerabilities, both for personal security and safety. But the most pernicious threat, I think, really comes from the liar's dividend. As people learn, which indicates that as people learn about deepfakes and AI-generated content, and that it is increasingly realistic and difficult to detect, false claims that real content is AI-generated becomes more persuasive, which could be used by politicians to make claims that their real actions and statements were actually a deepfake. Next slide, please. Now, it's important to acknowledge that despite all of these circumstances, given the risks, we can't admire the problem or even wait for legislation. We need concrete action now, and today I'll focus on key stakeholders that can take that action in the immediate term before US elections, before other elections around the world. Those actors are AI developers, distribution platforms, social media channels, political campaigns themselves, and election officials. But before I get into that, first is kind of the how for this. In order to make sure that these commitments happen with accountability, commitments need to be developed for civil society experts to be at the table. White House voluntary commitments occurred earlier last year that were developed behind closed doors. And while it's understandable that the companies are moving quickly here, more transparency is needed. Finally, it's also important for there to be public consultation on developing content policies with taking lessons from trust and safety that have been developed in recent years in order to develop effective usage policies and prevent harmful content. Here again, there are lessons from the trust and safety field around transparency reporting and mechanisms for allowing independent researchers to understand trends and the use of and spot emerging harms, which is something that CDT has recently released a report on around the independence of election researchers and the ways in which they're being increasingly politicized and attacked. Now, second is the who. We should be making, who should be making these commitments? As I've already kind of laid out those four stakeholders, model developers, platforms, politicians, and election officials. But finally, before I get into those recommendations, is context. There's increasingly difficult circumstances that we're facing in the 2024 election, which includes things like inadequate platform readiness compared to 2020 because of policy shifts from major platforms like X, who's now allowing political ads. Meta and Google have backslid on election denial policies. There's also been mass layoffs across the industry. In the United States, there are also partisan court cases and politically motivated congressional investigations, which have stifled independent misinformation researchers and made it more difficult for the government to share information and intelligence with the social media companies on these sorts of things. Finally, widening distribution channels from new social media platforms like Twitch and Discord have balkanized the information environment and made it very difficult to get access to a kind of coherent and cohesive demographic across the United States, and people have to be met where they are across these different channels, which is increasingly challenging to get proper authoritative information to the places where people are. Next slide.
Thanks, Tim. If you could just wrap up in a minute, that would be grand.
Sure. I think there are 4 slides here on recommendations for the various stakeholders here. I will kind of only get to the AI developers, and I think that I'll leave the others for the slides. But for AI developers, there are a number of places we think are very important. First is obviously there's new research into embedding watermarks and indicating that indicate synthetic media, which are important, but they're not a panacea. They won't solve all of these problems. In addition to those things, AI developers really need to focus on content rules that prevent text, audio, image, and videos from being used to generate harmful content. Now, we know that the majority of harmful content being generated is actually sexualized activity, but manipulated images of political figures and public figures using a person's voice or their image without their consent is a major issue that should also be addressed using usage rules. In addition to those things, interface restrictions to prevent things like campaign activity to personalize demographic targeting to individuals. I mentioned that that's a major concern at the beginning will be necessary. Techniques to surface authoritative information should be prioritized by AI developers when they're creating interventions on their platforms to shoot people to authoritative information. And they should use footnotes and hyperlinks to make people understand that their information might be outdated or include hallucination. Finally, disclosures and researcher access mechanisms are very important for these bodies to put in place. And more important than anything is investing in trust and safety within these organizations. Many of them are very small, and they have a long way to go to catch up to the traditional social media companies. I'll leave it there and pass on to my next panelists. Thank you all very much.
Great. Thanks so much, Tim. And like you said, the following two slides touch on recommendations for social media, for candidates, for electoral officers, and we can also maybe touch on that during the Q&A. But I think it sets it up very well for Jeff. Jeff Allen is the co-founder and chief research officer of the Integrity Institute, and he will talk about how the Integrity Institute has created best practice guides for technology companies to help better support healthy elections across the platforms. And hopefully, these can also be used by investors as tools to engage with companies. And so I think picking up from what Tim had been talking about as well, these recommendations and these guides, I think basically come together, and what the Integrity Institute is looking at to ensure that these best practices are put in place. So Jeff, over to you.
Hi, thank you so much, Ignita, for that introduction. Yeah, we can hop right in. So just a quick background of the Integrity Institute. We're part professional community, part think tank. On the professional community side, we're made up of people who have experience working for social media companies on integrity and trust and safety teams. So we are the people that have worked at Facebook fighting misinformation, or worked at Twitter, collaborating with external stakeholders, or worked at TikTok. I myself was at Facebook and Instagram on a couple of different integrity teams there. Next slide. So what are some of the general industry trends that we're seeing for 2024? And I do think that 2024 is going to look different from 2020 for a handful of different reasons. Number one, the tech layoffs will definitely have an impact. We've seen major layoffs across all of the major companies and even some of the mid-sized ones. And it's been, in the 10 to 30%, headcount reduction sometimes. And this has had a lot of impact on policy teams, on user researchers, on partnership managers, which are pretty crucial and important for getting elections right. So we definitely, will expect to see something from that. And so like the response that you get from Facebook or from X now, or from Google, will look a little bit different than it did in 2020, because there's just fewer people in those teams. We're also seeing a lot more diversity in platforms, right? So like TikTok, wasn't really a big deal in 2020, but it is going to be a big deal this year. We also have a lot of mid-sized platforms like Discord and Twitch that are going to be playing a bigger role, and they don't necessarily have the same experience that Meta and Google have, of having worked on elections for, 10 years or so. And then finally, we do see some platforms that just don't care at all about integrity and are very happy to play the role of disrupting democratic processes and disrupting democracies. Telegram is kind of my go-to example of a platform that doesn't really care if it's harming democracy, and doesn't really have integrity and trust and safety teams. And Telegram is it's not necessarily a huge deal in the US, but internationally it definitely can be a big deal, especially in like Eastern European countries. It's among the more popular platforms there. Next slide. So what are some of the examples that Integrity Institute is doing to try and help on this front? As Anita said, we're doing a lot of work establishing best practices, and what should platforms be doing on the inside to ensure that they're properly protecting elections and playing a good role. We want to see platforms partnering with civil societies. We want to see platforms partnering with researchers, to make sure that they get it right. And so, yes, we're harnessing our community to get out those best practices. We're helping connect our community to those external organizations and partners, and we're operating a little bit as a bridge from civil society to the companies. And we're also going to be doing our own original research to track platform performance. So here's an example of our best practice. So Anita said last year we put out 2 very big guides on all things election integrity. This year we're going to be putting out decks that are more narrower in scope but go deeper into the problem space. So case studies of attacks, what to do when things break down and you need to break the glass and implement emergency measures. How should platforms be responding to Gen AI, but also using AI to maybe better police the platforms. Another big trend that we're kind of excited to see is policy and regulation is coming. So the Digital Services Act passed in the EU, and it actually has some guidance to platforms on what the EU expects them to be doing in ensuring that their platforms are not harming democratic processes and are playing a good role. So in a lot of ways, the DSA is actually going to be acting as an enforcement mechanism for platforms to take election integrity more seriously and to do more work protecting elections. Next slide. I will pat the Integrity Institute on the back a little bit because we did get cited. And one of the guidance that the EU said is platforms should follow best practices and industry standards as those issued by us and a few different other organizations. What are some of the things that the DSA, the election guidance, calls out? And these are all things that, the Integrity Institute largely agrees with these. There's great alignment between it. So the EU wants to see platforms analyzing and appropriately moderating virality. This is great to see the European Commission call out. Virality is a little bit of a root problem. It's like, why is misinformation spread so fast? Why does hate speech spread so fast? A lot of that can be traced back to virality mechanisms on the platform. Demonetization of disinformation content, right? Platforms create a lot of incentives for different content creators around the world. That incentives is always greatest when the platforms themselves are paying people, right? So, on YouTube, you can run a channel, and if you get into the partnership program, YouTube will send you checks, right, as revenue share for ads. Same thing on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok. And so it's really important to make sure that the platforms are not playing a role and are not actually mailing checks and funding disinformation operations and disinformation actors. The EU wants the platforms to open up to third-party scrutiny and research, which is super important, especially in 2024, then when there's going to be elections around the world, right? Like, none of the platforms have employees, in every single country where the election is going to be a big deal, where their platform is going to play a big deal, a big role in the election. And so it's super important for platforms that, all based in California, right? It's really important to make sure that they are working with third parties and that they're working with researchers that have that local expertise and context to make sure that the platform is playing a good role. And the EU also wants to see, oh, sorry, I can go back real quick. The EU also wants to see, really strong incident response plans. And so this is basically calling for really robust operations inside the companies to prepare, it's like red teaming, but also respond to rapidly changing events, right? Elections are critical moments, for societies. And you can have, critical instances when, one particular thing happens, and the platforms need to be ready to invest the right amount of resources to respond to those responsibly. An example of some of the original research that we're going to be doing at the Integrity Institute. So we do an analysis where we track how much each different platform amplifies misinformation. We sort of track, right? Like, if someone posts misinformation, how much additional engagement, how many additional views should they expect to get? And we sort of track that as like the amplification factor. So in 2022, we did this just in the US to sort of compare all the different platforms against each other so that we could say, oh, Twitter amplifies misinformation by, 32x. TikTok amplifies misinformation by almost 25x, compared to Instagram that amplifies misinformation by 2x. So we can actually see, like, oh, how are the different platforms designed, and how do those different design choices that they make play into how much misinformation spreads on the platform. In 2024, with elections around the world, the question that we want to get at, the story that we want to tell is, as bad as things get in the US, things can get much, much worse internationally. And so we want to be able to compare, how much is Twitter amplifying misinformation in the US to how much is Twitter amplifying misinformation in India or in European elections or in Asian elections this year. And you expect to see a difference because platforms invest differently, in different countries. There's plenty of countries that don't get a ton of attention from the platforms, and so we would expect that misinformation will be amplified more heavily there. Yeah, so finally, to sort of summarize, 2024 will be different than 2020. You have a wave of elections globally that's going to be putting more stress on platforms that they had in 2020. And we also see, industry trends, right? Like there's new platforms coming up that don't have the experience. And there's been the layoffs, right? So the platforms are going to be a little bit more strapped for resources, during this big wave around the world. And we also see that regulation is coming, and this would be a great time to sort of highlight to the companies, hey, you're going to be forced to do this, or you're going to end up paying fines if you don't do it. So why not prepare now? Today is a great day to prepare for all the coming regulation that will be forcing platforms to prepare for elections better. And it's a great time to push that. Just because the EU passed it doesn't mean that other countries aren't always going to be passing it, right? And they should be taking the EU practices and applying them globally to prepare for everything that's coming to them. And obviously, like the Integrity Institute, we're deeply invested in, the role that social media platforms play in elections. We think there's a lot of work that they could be doing. We definitely think that social media platforms could be playing a positive role, in democracies and in societies, and we just aren't seeing that yet. And so we're sort of trying to push for that brighter future when social media, we feel comfortable with the role that social media is playing. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks so much for that, Jeff. And, it seems like, I think our three panelists have really sort of set the scene. I almost feel like you guys just come together and provide all the solutions and we'll solve this problem for the rest of the world. But, we'll definitely discuss some of that during question and answers, but wanting to get our investor discussant on board. Lauren, if I'm not seeing you on camera yet. Hey, Lauren. Great.
Yeah, I'm on camera. I've been on camera. Don't worry.
That's wonderful. No, let me just introduce you, Lauren, and great to have you. Lauren is the managing director and head of stewardship and engagement from Boston Common Asset Management, and she's been actively engaging tech companies in a range of issues, including digital rights and AI accountability. Boston Common was one of the investors who signed a letter that was sent to big tech companies following the Jan 6 attack on the U.S. Capitol, asking boards to address their role in enabling and facilitating violence at the U.S. Capitol, and for appropriate board committees to prevent and mitigate that harm from coming, from happening again. So, these are investors who've been really engaging on this issue, and really would welcome your comments, Lauren.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, Jeff, I absolutely would love if every tech company applied the EU Digital Services Act and Ethical AI Act, globally. In the absence of probably that not happening, right? There are a few things that I think companies and investors should be asking specifically. One, what have you learned from doing some of the DSA implementation, right, in terms of risk assessment and gaps in oversight? I'm going to highlight a couple of things which really are aligned with the way we've engaged tech companies currently. One is that we need to look at the full value chain of the use of AI. So we need to understand all the actors. So it was great that Tim highlighted, I believe, AI developers and AI social media platforms. We have to look at their unique role and their unique governance and oversight. I think for me as an investor, I want to understand how each company is assessing the real risk and the mitigation opportunities during the 2024 election cycle. And in particular, not just at group level, but at local level. So this idea of creating heat maps of risk across the globe, especially in the global majority, assessing that risk and then thinking about what would be an appropriate approach to proactively investing in tools and safeguards in those highest risk countries, right? And one of those recommendations, obviously, is investing in local partnership, local resources, and this game of, for example, constantly changing the outsourcing of content moderation doesn't help stability there, right? So this idea, again, of sort of investing in trust and safety and safeguards and integrity staff is really important. The other thing that I think is really important, and one of the asks we had, and I think one of the asks of Alexandra's group, was this idea of Could you disclose, so transparency and disclosure around election policies and programs? What are you actually doing? What is your assessment of risk? What are your opportunities for mitigation? And to think about not just English language, like there needs to be a hyper focus on local language and the idea of, the micro targeting, for example. So this idea of non-English language investment in terms of process. The other thing we've talked about is, embedding by design, embedding safety and safeguards by design in the use of generative AI and algorithms. So in particular, I thought it was really important, this idea of sort of embedding the suppression of extreme content and hate, right, speech, and extreme views in the use of generative AI. And finally, I want to highlight this idea of really providing timely information to customers of these platforms on opt-in and opt-outs around the use of algorithms and generative AI in particular. And I believe Instagram might have come out with something recently with, looking at, at least suppressing some of the automated sort of, algorithm, right, in terms of extreme. One other thing I just wanted to highlight, and I found it particularly helpful because it's very concrete. Again, this whole value chain cycle of information and this idea of watermarking and content provenance is super critical in terms of election election officials and those that are campaigning. And then finally, again, this idea of mitigation, that content should be earmarked, right? Misinformation should be earmarked, and context should be provided. Again, so that's sort of on the other side of like the distribution and having not only investors, but also consumers and customers of these platforms understanding where information is. There's a lot more I could highlight, but I think this idea, I'm going to just say one more thing. In the absence of regulation, especially in the markets where rule of law doesn't exist, these social media and AI generators and these platforms need to have an enhanced approach and vigilance to content moderation and the use of generative AI and really the outputs and the real harm, both to customers, human rights defenders, and actually candidates themselves. So I'll stop there.
No, great. No, thanks so much, Lauren, for really drawing together the different points that the panelists raised, and bringing that in from the investor perspective. We have a few questions that have come in, but I just wanted to pause as well to see if any of the panelists had anything to add to what Lauren, or any comments to what Lauren can say before I jump into the first question. Okay, if not, I'm just going to jump into the first question and we can pick up the points along the way. There have been recent headlines about politicians using AI-generated deepfakes. I don't know whether they're called deepfakes anymore, of themselves, for example, in Indonesia and Pakistan, as ways to put forward their true voice. And in a sense, the use of these deepfakes, and I put that in inverted commas, is a way for dissident voices to be heard in as an alternative. So it's just, this really puts things in sort of a little bit of a gray area, and was just wondering, and would really like to go around to our panelists to kind of provide some comment on what they feel that use of AI is going to be helpful or not in allowing voices, unheard certain voices to be heard. Tim, do you want to kick this off?
Sure, happy to. Well, first of all, I think that it's a really important point that we focus very heavily on the risks of AI, but I think that opportunities and their use cases in elections are often missed. And there are a lot of them that are potentially useful and that get a lot of interest from political candidates, from election officials, and their use cases are already developing. As you mentioned, in Indonesia, we're seeing them used for developing campaign slogans and for advancing the messaging of candidates. In Pakistan, we're seeing it used as an opportunity to show a candidate their voice, while obviously for the former president while he's in prison. But these are ways of taking an opportunity that I think that a lot of other candidates may be interested in, and giving them initial use. One of those ways might be for candidates to create artificial clones of their voice so that they can speak live in circumstances where they're already in a different campaign rally, so that they can get to more constituents when there just aren't enough hours in the day to do so. And those are really interesting use cases because, importantly, they aren't, I don't think that they meet the definition of a deepfake because there's consent involved. They are deciding that they want to develop a speech and they are cloning their voice for the purpose of an authentic use of their own voice. And I think that that's a really interesting use case, but it begs the question of how we differentiate good actors using these tools for an opportunity rather than bad actors using them to deceive voters, right? And I think that's a key distinction that's become very challenging. As we saw earlier this week, the FCC recently just announced that the use of AI-generated robocalls is illegal under existing law. So how then are candidates, like, for instance, in Pennsylvania, where a candidate was using a Civux platform to give robocalls to voters, explicitly framing that it is a AI-generated robocall to provide information to their constituents and to help with their campaigning. There's now questions about whether or not those things are legal, even though I would argue that guide rails for their use may be better than outright banning productive uses where it is obvious and transparent that AI is being used for political campaign purposes.
Alexandra, did you have any comment to that as well? And maybe in the context of, you talked about that it was only Meta that had put something out relating, and something very initial out relating to how they're going to address the risks in the elections, and it's been basically silent from the likes of other platform companies. Maybe in that context, anything to add here to that discussion?
Well, I think what we're seeing, for example, in the whole AI discussion is kind of policy development on the hoof. So it's kind of responding to things happening as they're happening. And that's a very worrying sign. It's not like AI was, and the use of AI generated content has just started happening now. And yet the platforms don't seem to be ready. And we are in a kind of regulatory void, in almost everywhere. So that's the kind of worrying thing, the fact that we're on the back foot with, uses and misuses of these technologies, so that I would say there needs to be an honest and transparent discussion around these issues, not responses just, in reaction to negative press coverage. Or, the Meta Oversight Board, for example, their kind of statement triggering a response from Meta. So I'd say the platforms need to be more proactive. They need to be engaging proactively in a debate and discussion around the ethics and good policymaking, how to start good policymaking around AI and all of these issues, and being frank around where they lack resourcing to actually engage in partnerships much more proactively.
Thanks so much, Alexandra. And Jeff, in that, also there's a question for you in the chat box specifically, but feel free to also comment on the current discussion. But this question: what could be some short-term motivations companies have to take a polycentric approach of staffing people from host countries to properly research the impact of social media on the 2024 elections and future elections?
Yeah, so like how would you pitch that internally to the companies to try and convince them? Is that kind of the question?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, I think like you know, the industry in a whole is in a pretty bad place, to be perfectly honest, right? I think like Pew Research, right, like last year or the year before did a poll of Americans and said, like, do you think positive or social media has a positive influence on society? And 64% of people said no, right? So it's like the industry as a whole is not in a pretty great place. And you know, it's not great for the industry's future if a huge majority of people say that you are bad for us and for society, right? Like that doesn't, you know, and in the 20-year time horizon, I don't feel too great about that, right? And the trend is very much in the wrong direction. And so, you know, if I was at the companies, I'd be like, look, like the trend line is very bad. It's very much not in our favor. Regulation is coming, right? Like today is the, you know, the best day to tackle the problem, right? Was like 10 years ago, but you know, today is the second best day to tackle this problem. And so it's like basically like, you know, the sentiment is coming for us that we're bad for people. You know, regulation is coming that's going to be forcing us to do more anyway. Let's just seize the opportunity, you know, to get a lot of wins in playing positive roles in elections around the world, right? Like, let's actually do the hard work to prove that social media can play a positive role in elections. You know, I think it's kind of sad in a lot of ways that, like, you know, one trend that we're seeing right now is Threads saying that Threads doesn't want any politics on it, and so they're blocking politics and blocking news. And it's like, are you really just abandoning that use case for social media? Are you really, do you really hate your product so much and you're so pessimistic about your product that you don't actually think there's any positive role for Threads to play in the news and play in politics? Because I think there's lots of positive things that Threads could be doing in politics. And so I would kind of like frame it that way of like, there's a huge opportunity here. To get ahead of a lot of the trends that are, you know, giving headwinds to the industry and a lot of regulation that's coming.
Well, we're heading towards the end of the hour, and I wanted to give the opportunity to all the panelists, and I was going to start with you, Jeff, since you were speaking. Is what would be the top? This is an investor audience that we're speaking to, right? Primarily. So what would your top recommendations be for investors who own shares in a lot of these technology companies, these AI developers, etc.? What should be the messaging and their engagement with the companies? And so I'm going to start with Jeff, go to Tim, Alexandra, and end with Lauren.
Yeah, so there's a lot. I think like one idea that I would like to put in your head is that there's a really big difference in designing a platform to optimize for, you know, engagement tomorrow versus optimizing for engagement 5 years from now. And the longer time horizon you put out the engagement that you're optimizing for, the more and more important it is actually to build the platform safely, build the platform with integrity. If you want to maximize revenue tomorrow, it's very simple. Yeah, just show a lot of hate speech, show a lot of misinformation, show a lot of nudity. That is going to maximize engagement tomorrow. But that is going to kill your brand, and it's not going to be so good for a year from now. And there's actually a lot of research that has been trickling out from the companies now that, like, yes, as you increase the time horizon for company growth to longer and longer time horizons, building safely, building with integrity, building with responsibility comes to be a real advantage. And so, like, I would just put that overall framing in your mind, right? The longer we can get these companies to maximize engagement, the longer we can get these companies to maximize their growth, and the longer horizon we can push them towards, the more and more they're going to be behaving responsibly.
Yeah, that's what we talk about all the time in the investment world. We're looking for long-term value creation, and not for short-term gains. Tim, recommendations for
thanks. I think that's a really fair point, Jeff. And honestly, I think something that social media companies need to hear more often. I would say kind of my top recommendation is, I think that the focus on watermarking and content provenance is helpful, but by itself is insufficient. I think that a lot of social media platforms at the moment are seeing and are moving in a direction, and the AI developers themselves as well, where they're taking a more hands-off approach in trust and safety, and instead relying on more labeling, more hands-off approaches to content moderation. And I think that that's kind of a harmful way of thinking about things, because for one, the tech isn't fully there yet on watermarking and content provenance, right? It's still very hard to detect text. There's almost no way to do so as being AI generated, much less audio, right? It's getting a little bit better for images and video, but audio and text are two that are extremely difficult to watermark or have any metadata that's transferable across platforms. I think so. So relying too heavily on tech solutions here and product solutions is a failure. Instead, I think usage rules for the generation of content and usage rules around the spread of that content need to be emphasized. Doing things like, to Jeff's point, to kind of to put a counter on it a little bit, but also to agree with it, removing content or making it unrecommendable just because it's AI generated or just because it is political, I think isn't necessarily the right approach. Instead, a holistic approach where you are giving users opt-outs, giving people the ability to control how much of this sort of content they see, and then limiting the most harmful content that spreads misinformation and disinformation and hate speech and other content, I think is the most measured approach, but it requires a whole of platform policy consideration.
Yeah. Alexandra.
Yeah, so I think what's key for me, and plus ones to everything that's been said so far, in terms of platform design, etc. We need transparency and disclosure around content moderation systems now, around their risk assessment and mitigations in relation to these elections this year. And in order to have a very honest, frank discussion about content moderation and how it's scaled across the world, by these companies. We have disclosures under the Digital Services Act for the EU market. We have some disclosures in Australia. I mean, we really need global disclosures. And the only way we're going to get that is from investors using their voice, at this point in time. It's really fundamental, because otherwise we can't have an honest discussion, informed debate, right, about the business model and how it's scaled and where it needs to go. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
5 words.
Right.
The ditto on transparency and disclosure, but assessment and action from that is super critical. And I think in the short term, we should be asking every media company for what is your plan during the 2022 election cycle in terms of risk and mitigation, and especially in that highest risk quadrant.
Well said, Lauren, and thank you for all of you for your time today and sharing with us your expertise. Really appreciate it. Hopefully this is the first of a few discussions on this important topic during the year, and thanks to everyone who was on the call or who participated in the webinar. Thanks then. Bye-bye.